Okay, well, thank you, Heather, and thank you everyone for coming and bringing oysters as part of our talk tonight. So, good evening and welcome to the UC Davis Turk Science Speak seminar. How many people here have been to this seminar series before? Good. How many people are first time? Good. We encourage you to keep coming back. So we do talks both here at Sunnyside as well as talks over in Incline. And for those of you that are long-time participants in our talk series, you know that we used to be mainly over there. Now we partner up with Sunnyside and continue these talks on a wide variety of different topics. Please turn your phones off or to vibrate so that it doesn't disturb anybody. And also a special thanks to Sunnyside, their staff and our staff. And I'm looking over the AmeriCorps who organize and get everything organized for us to come here. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, even though we're here on a freshwater system and we're learning about oysters, we cover a broad variety of topics around the world in both our research and our education. And so we're always encouraging people to get involved and participate in what we do. Please go to our website at tahoe.ucdavis.edu. You can also follow us on social media. You can participate in our activities. We do a variety of different activities in terms of lectures, a docent program. We have a kayaking circumnavigation that we do each summer. We have our Grow Your Own festival. We participate in a lot of different activities around the basin. And so usually I have Tim here, Tim Koger, who talks about giving and participating. And so he's not here, so I'm going to try to just do a bit of a plug for us as a public university. We're here as part of our mission, but funding from the state only covers part of what we do. And so we rely on projects and we rely on private donors who get involved with our mission and what we do. So we encourage you, if you're interested, to come talk to us about how you get engaged with our program. We also have a couple other lectures coming up. And so the first one is October 10th, called Why We Remember, the Science of Memory and How It Shapes Us. This is going to be over at our Incline Center. And so we encourage you to sign up and get engaged with that. And then back here on October 24th, we're going to be doing a talk called Forest is a Verb, a Landscape Lens on Climate. So lots of different activities that we're doing. So now we're going to introduce our two speakers tonight. So the first one is Dr. Tessa Hill. She's the Associate Vice Provost for Academic Programs and Public Scholarship and Engagement at UC Davis. She's a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences and Bodega Marine Laboratory. She is the co-author of the book At Every Depth. That's about how communities of people are coming together to protect the ocean environment. She's part of the Bodega Ocean Acidification Research Group, the BOAR group, at the Bodega Marine Laboratory, which aims to understand the impact of ocean acidification on marine species and West Coast communities. Dr. Hill leads an industry academic partnership to understand the consequences of ocean acidification on shellfish farmers on the Northern California coast. And she's joined by Dr. Gary Fleener, who supports education, research, and development at the Hog Island Oyster Co, and I'm assuming is the one that brought the oysters today. So thank you. He received his PhD in geography from the University of Colorado Boulder, where he examined the intersection of flood hydrology, geomorphic processes, and native cottonwood forest regeneration at the eastern edge of the Colorado Plateau.
How did I get lost in the ocean?
Exactly. Academic paths are torturous ones that are highly convoluted at the same time. Dr. Fleener is passionate about problem solving at the intersection of sustainable foodways and healthy ecosystems. So with that, let's please give a hand for our two speakers, Tessa and Gary. Yeah. I'm just handing this mic to you, Gary. Oh, good.
Okay, I am kicking us off, and first I'm going to check. I have like a really good professor-teacher voice, so I just want to make sure that you all can hear me in the back. and tell me if you'd rather me be mic'd. Are we good? Okay, great. Like my day job is speaking to large auditoriums of undergraduates, so this works well. Thank you so much to the Turk staff for hosting both Gary and I. I know that we've really been looking forward to being here. It's been an exciting point that Gary and I have talked about multiple times over the summer, that we got to come up here and bring a little piece of the ocean to all of you and maybe share some ocean stories with all of you. I live and work very close to the coast. So even though I'm a UC Davis professor, I'm actually based out at Bodega Marine Lab, which is kind of like the Turk of the coast. So it's a lot like what you just heard about from Alex in terms of the UC Davis Tahoe presence up here, but UC Davis has a presence at a marine fields facility out on the Sonoma County coast, and that is where I'm from. So it probably won't shock you that I'm an ocean lover, but it turns out I also really love mountain lakes. And my family and I have gotten in a wonderful habit of every summer making sure we get a little mountain lake time. So I really appreciate being able to be here today. And I wanted to tell you that to give you permission, the lake will forgive you. You can love the lake and the ocean. So that's going to be our starting point. My plan for today is to tell you a little story from the book, At Every Depth, which is in the back of the room, if any of you are interested in it. I want to tell you some of the themes that emerge from that book, and I'm going to give you a little hint at how we end the book, because I think it's important for us to think about hope and action and optimism, and that's the way that we end the book. I'm also really excited to be sharing this evening with my colleague and friend Gary, because our sustainable relationship to the foods that we eat from the ocean takes center stage for some of the stories that weave us into the ocean. And you will notice I'm using a few notes tonight. I never do that when I'm giving scientific talks, but there's a story I want to tell you, and I don't actually want to mess up the details. The details matter, and so I have notes with me so that I can get the story just right. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask all of you to think about your connection to the ocean. So maybe it's the last time you visited. Maybe it's a childhood memory. Maybe it's something you read or watched or listened to that helps you feel connected to watery parts of our planet that are also salty. I want to pause here so you can think about that for a minute. I'm hoping that at the end, when you ask Gary and I questions, that you might also share with us something about your connection to the ocean. So I'm hoping you will hold that connection through our chat today. And the other thing I would like to start with is a quote from Rachel Carson. And so she says, "Who has known the ocean? Neither you nor I. With our earthbound senses, know the foam and the surge of the tide that beats over the crab, hiding under the seaweed of his tide pool home, or the lilt of the long, slow swells of mid-ocean, where shoals of wandering fish prey and are preyed upon, and the dolphin breaks the waves to breathe the upper atmosphere." Many people will be most familiar with her most famous book, Silent Spring, which is often cited as an inspiration for the launch of the environmental movement in the United States. The publication of that book was over 60 years ago, and it was a major milestone for the US environmental movement. It called upon scientists and the public at large to address what she felt at the time was the greatest threat to the natural world, and that was industrial scale pollution associated with chemical contaminants. But in fact, in addition to and even long before that foundational work of Silent Spring, she was a scientist, a naturalist, and a keen observer of the ocean. She was also the weaver of great stories. She intentionally used narrative to bring people in closer connection with the natural world. She began this with the publication of her first book, Under the Sea Wind, in 1941, and continued that throughout her life and career. I've included a quote from her here, and I'm going to show you a quote from another author towards the end of my talk that's from a more recent book that I think is also very resonant with these discussions that we're having today. So Rachel Carson inspired many of us to take time to become observers of the natural world. This is something I continue to strive to teach my students at UC Davis to this day, to pause, to breathe, to observe the tree, the lake, the stream, the bird, the flower, the bee, the snail, the fish around them. But often students ask me, why is observing so important at a time like this? Couldn't our time be better spent elsewhere? Are we at a point where there is so much urgency around the natural world that we no longer have time to observe? And so the story I would like to tell you today is an answer to that question. The story starts with and centers around, at least in part, this paper. If you ask many scientists, particularly marine scientists, but also biologists in general, about what papers opened their eyes to the shifting landscape that we will face as a consequence of human-caused climate change, many people point directly to this paper by Jim Barry, Chuck Baxter, Rafe Sagrin, and Sarah Gilman. It was published in 1995. But the origin of this paper began much earlier than that. In 1931, a young man named Willis Hewitt arrived in Monterey, California, to pursue his PhD. He was here at a time of great significance for California history. This was the era of Steinbeck's Cannery Row and the biological discoveries of Ed Ricketts. Inspired by those folks, Hewitt decided he wanted to understand the arrangement of the animals in these tide pools in front of Hopkins Marine Station. In 1931, actually I'm gonna skip back. In 1931, he drove a series of iron bolts into the granite that formed the tide pools. For 3 years, he worked along this transect that was identified by these bolts, and he counted and categorized everything living in these pools. He completed his work in 1935. He filed his dissertation. He moved back to Texas to become a professor of biology. He could not have possibly known the message that he sent to future generations, the value of what we now call baseline data. To understand this story, my colleague Eric Simmons and I had the pleasure of meeting with Jim Barry, who's on the left-hand side of the screen. You'll recognize his name was one of the authors on that paper I showed you. We spent time with Jim and we shuffled through those exact tide pools with our own wading boots. Jim told us that in the early 1990s, his colleague and friend Chuck Baxter, who worked at Hopkins Marine Station, mentioned to him that he looked at the tide pools and he just felt like they looked different. And it was hard to pinpoint what exactly, but there was something that he felt like had changed in his time as a professor at the Marine Station. So Jim and Chuck hatched this plan that they should go back and look at the Hewitt data and reconstruct the exact same data set in the tide pool, and that they should do so in partnership with undergraduate students at the Marine Station. So for many years in a row, they pitched this project to undergraduate students in the Marine Station, and the students were not interested. Until, fortunately, Rafe Sagrin and Sarah Gilman came along, two undergraduates who were like, hey, that sounds intriguing, let's do it. There was just a little bit of a problem, which is that no one could remember exactly where Hewitt's transect was. So he had described the transect carefully in his work, but a clear line to sketch out the path of the study site was not included in his thesis. Dissertation advisors are groaning as I say this, because it's like your worst nightmare. Wait, there's not a map to show where your study site is? Okay, So Sagarin, Gilman, Baxter, and Berry plunged into the tide pools to look for Hewitt's bolts. Berry told us that he remembers being in these tide pools at low tide in the middle of the night with Coleman lanterns, casting the granite in sharp relief, pushing piles of seaweed aside to find the bolts with metal detectors, and they found them. That's a picture of the bolt right there. So they found the bolts, and during low tides that year, Gilman and Sagarin would lay down a 1 yard square box at each bolt, and they would count and identify everything within it. By the end of the spring, they documented 58,000 individual animals. The next step was to compare what they'd counted to the species and the positioning that Hewitt had described 60 years earlier. And so here's the pool once more that they did that work in. In their 1995 article, Berry, Baxter, Gilman, and Sagarin reported that the abundance of 8 warm water southern associated species had increased at this site. 5 cold water associated species had decreased since the survey in 1935. I'm showing you some of those warm water associated species here. The shift in assemblages coincided with measurements of water temperature that had been taken at the marine station. And that indicated warming over several decades due to climate change. The lesson of this story was built on some of the smallest inhabitants of the tide pools, and yet it carried a pretty big headline. For those of us interested in observing the ocean, we didn't have to wait to document the impacts of climate change. The ocean species were already on the move. Other scientists had already begun to grapple with this same problem. You may be familiar with studies that document shifting assemblages of trees, or changing USDA hardiness zones, or the movement of butterfly species. These types of species were being done at the same, these types of studies were being done at the same time. But because the tide pool survey connected something about our current observations to the observations of the past, this survey landed with particular heft. While the tide pool surveys were being discovered and rediscovered in Monterey, there was another kind of discovery happening at the same time that I want to tell you about. I would like to introduce you to Linda Yamane, a Rumsen Ohlone tribe member from the Central California coast, what we now know as Monterey. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, she went looking for an archive of notes about the Rumsen Ohlone language, songs, and traditions. Her grandmother had told her stories, but she generally felt that she didn't know very much about her own Rumsen culture. As she grew older, her curiosity also grew. In 1985, someone mentioned to Linda that the San Jose State University Library held an archive of mostly unexamined Ohlone information. It was a treasure trove of information stored there by an Ohlone woman named Isabel Meadows, pictured here, who was working with an ethnographer named John Harrington. Isabel Meadows was the last fluent speaker of the Rumsen language. She worked with Harrington towards the end of her life to intentionally document language, stories, songs, and traditions around the Monterey area. She died in 1939, which means her last association around the Monterey area would have coincided with Hewitt's time working in the tide pools. It was surprisingly difficult for Yamane to get an appointment even to see the archives at the library. Librarians gave her conflicting information about what was there and whether or not she could gain access to it, but she was stubborn in her persistence. She gained access to the Meadows and Harrington archives eventually. During the same time period that those Hopkins scientists brushed through seaweed in the darkness, looking for bolts in unvisited since Hewitt had left them, Linda Yamane pushed through the darkness of that library in search for Rumsen knowledge, rarely accessed since Meadows had dictated it in the 1930s. Yamane has written about how she originally felt shy saying her ancestors' words out loud. She would practice them late at night, sitting awake in bed while her family slept. From basic words, she moved to songs. She began talking to basket makers from the other Northern California tribes. She became the first Ohlone to weave a traditional Ohlone-style basket in 150 years. Interested in the canoes in which the Rumsen navigated their watery world, she joined a group to build one of the first Thule canoes to ply the San Francisco Bay since the 1800s. Since then, she has built more than 30 Thule canoes. Several times now, she has paddled the canoes in the Great Tide Pool in front of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, just a few steps from that tide pool survey that I told you about. She became an expert in working with shells to create beads, used as decoration on baskets and for jewelry. To do this, she had to become an expert in where to find those shells, where to find the species that were of interest for those jewelry making, and on what beaches to find them and how to treat them in the sunshine to create material that would withstand jewelry making. When researching this story, Eric and I met with Linda over dinner in Monterey to hear the story I just told you, which she gave us permission to share. And she arrived wearing shell jewelry, of course. She talked to us about the work it takes to find and revive a lost connection. She was the first of several people in the process of researching this book that told us that it takes courage to continue to watch a changing world, and tremendous foresight to record and document those observations. She sees herself as creating new beauty out of old knowledge. That knowledge that Yamane gained is of incredible value. I'm sure you will agree. In the same years that Hewitt had spent recording a one-of-a-kind message to the future scientific community, Meadows and Ohlone elders had gifted future generations the information they would need to revive this culture. Yamane and Barry and his colleagues were observant enough to know that lessons from the past can help us shape and understand the future. That even sometimes we don't know why we are steadfastly observing, but that we hope that someone will pick up that archive like a message in a bottle. The story that I've just told you forms the first chapter of At Every Depth. And we worked on this book, Eric and I, together for several years, even through a pandemic, in fact, with a shared goal of helping us all forge a stronger reconnection between people and the ocean. And so the book is called At Every Depth. And in writing the book, what Eric and I realized and talked about a lot is that we can very easily relate to and provide tangible examples of how the natural world is being impacted by humans in terrestrial systems. So I think it's probably all very easy for us to imagine, and even we have personal experiences with drought, wildfire, intense winter storms, unusually large hurricanes, etc. These things are part of our human experience now in the natural world. But when we look out at the ocean, it is sometimes hard to convince people that what you see is a vast blue expanse, but that same scale of ecological change is happening in the ocean too. The equivalent of heat waves and ecosystem overturn, into the equivalent of sort of wildfires on land, is happening in the ocean too. And it's just hard for us to see. So I talked a lot about the power of observation, and I just want to highlight and give you some hints on some of the other themes of the book. And this will give me a great way to hand off to Gary. The first of these themes is connection. So the connection between us and the ocean, and us and each other, right? So the book has us thinking about how we connect to the ocean and how we connect and meet with other people who want to make better decisions on behalf of the natural world. The book interweaves stories of people who feel connected about the ocean all around the world and who use that connection as a motivation to make a better future. The second theme I want to tell you is about knowledge. So we never come straight out and tell the reader this, but I will tell you. One of the implicit messages of the book is that we need to value many different types of knowledge when we are thinking about the natural world and the ocean. So many people we found are very knowledgeable about the ocean. Scientists are one of them, but so are people who live and work along the coast every day, coastal communities, fishermen, people who are earning their living on the coast and ocean, indigenous communities, conservation groups. I could go on and on. There's many types of ocean knowledge, and the book explicitly weaves together those different perspectives and knowledges. And we're going to hear more about that from Gary in just a moment. So this is an excellent example. We feature in the book the amazing knowledge that the owners and staff at Hog Island Oyster Farm have about the natural world and how they have partnered that knowledge with scientists in some really lovely ways. So the Oyster Company has for decades now been working directly with scientists to improve sustainable practices, conserve threatened species, and consider local solutions to climate change. And so that's a really great example of that knowledge sharing. And the final theme I want to share is about action. So the book tells you about how others are taking action, and we're hoping that it inspires you to do the same. The image I'm showing you here is an abalone. How many of you have eaten or seen or held an abalone in your hand in your lifetime? Wonderful. So glad to see so many raised hands. Abalone are a deep part of our culture in California, extending back for thousands of years for indigenous tribes. However, we have unfortunately recently loved them to death. So there are no longer any abalone species that are recreationally or commercially harvested on the coast of California because we have consumed so many of them, and they have been stressed by diseases and pathogens and a changing ocean climate. So this is where I'm going to give you a hint about how we end the book, because it was very important to end the book on a particular note. So as Eric and I were working on the book several years ago, we had sort of crafted that first chapter, which I just told you a little bit about, and we had crafted sort of an outline of where the book was going to go. But our agent, who was trying to sell the book to a publisher, said, listen, you have to write the final chapter. And we were like, what do you mean? How would we do that? How could we write the end chapter of a book we've barely started? And she said, I need to be able to convince people that this book ends on a point of action and optimism, not on a point of sadness. So I need you to draft the end. And so this felt like a big challenge until one day we were invited to attend the blessing and celebration of the first release of endangered white abalone back into the ocean. So white abalone are the tastiest of the abalone species, at least that's what a lot of people think. And because that we loved them to death very early on, they were one of the first species to no longer be commercially and recreationally harvested. White abalone were the first species, so the first marine invertebrate to ever be listed on the Endangered Species Act. And they had become so few and far between in the ocean. This is a marine snail that's crawling around on the rocks in the ocean. They'd become so few and far between that the scientific community said these snails are on a course for extinction because they can no longer find each other to reproduce. So the future is clear. And so a team from NOAA and eventually UC Davis began work to try to restore and culture the species in the lab. And by 2019, they were so successful at restoring the species in the lab that they were allowed to start releasing hundreds of them back out into the wild in the ocean. So we were there on the first day that this was happening, the first release was happening. And on that day of gathering, there were scientists there who had spent a decade trying to figure out the tricks of how to get this marine snail to reproduce in the lab, which was tricky. There were facilities managers who had built aquariums and seawater systems to keep these abalone as happy as they could be. There were federal and state agency representatives, there were conservation groups, and there were multiple indigenous communities that came to bless the importance of the abalone returning to its environment. And so I will tell you, the end of the book is the story of the return of the white abalone to the ocean. And at the end of that blessing ceremony, the woman who was leading that project, Dr. Kristen Aquilino, read a poem to the white abalone about all of the time she had spent caring for them in the lab. And the full poem is actually up at the book table if you want to read it. But the last words of the book are the final words of her poem. And that is because her words in essence say, we are saving you as a species because saving ourselves is bound up in that same process. Okay, so I'm almost done. I'm gonna hand off to Gary. But I wanted to feature and quote another amazing author, which is Elizabeth Rush. If you haven't read her writing, it's quite amazing. She says in her newest book, I think about those who left Paradise, California, the day that it burned, about those fleeing devastating drought in the Middle East, about all of the people who have already surrendered one definition of home for another, and hopefully for the promise of safety. I think about the Thwaites Glacier, that's the topic of this book, its grounding line, how it too is on the move, and how no amount of present day mitigation will fuse it back to the land it left. I am still trying to understand what the ice reveals by coming undone, and what its disintegration asks of us. So I picked this quote. It is resonant with me for a couple of reasons, and I suspect with some of you in the room, we'll be able to share this experience because many of us have had our communities deeply impacted by wildfire, including my own community where I live. And so this idea that we are all on the move to a safer place, that's our hope, and a better future is something that resonates with me. But also she asks us to think about what the changes in the natural world ask of us. And so I think what I want to end with before I hand off to Gary is, what is the ocean asking of us? What are we willing to do to protect that connection that you identified at the beginning of my talk that we have to the ocean? I started with this image because it's one of my favorite places in Tomales Bay. I'm really pleased to hand off now to my friend and colleague, Gary, who earlier taught us how to shuck and eat oysters. But he's going to tell you a little bit about the story of Hog Island Oyster Company and how their story is also interwoven with the future of a healthy ocean.
Thank you. What are you hitting
You
to
just
advance?
click that.
Great. I got this to pour into this deal, having to go after Dr. Hill, because that was awesome. How many people have been to Hog Island? It turns out from working the bar, I know, because when you work the bar, you find things out, right? so show me just so I know who's familiar with us as a company and who's actually been to the farm rather than the restaurants. A few of you as well. That's great. So as an overview, Hog Island Oyster Company's been around for about 41 years now. This is our downtown San Francisco kind of flagship oyster bar. And a lot of people in the world do know about us from our restaurants because that's kind of where we tell our story and deliver the product. But the backstory actually takes place here. And this is a different view. That little island in Tessa's photo, Hog Island, is right there in this aerial. We didn't do that on purpose, but it's kind of fun that we did it that way. And I want to start here because everything that we eat comes from somewhere, with maybe the exception of the Impossible Burger, right? And not only does everything that we eat come from somewhere, everything that we eat ultimately traces back to a wild organism on the planet. Plant, an algae, an animal that at one point was cruising around in the wild, and we domesticated it maybe a long time ago or a middle amount of time ago. And one of the things that drew me to shellfish was that that line is really short, right? If it's 8,000 years for chickens, it's about 30 years for oysters, because for the vast majority of humans' interactions with shellfish, we've been procuring them from the wild. And Tomales Bay is a cool example. Those of you know, this is Point Reyes National Seashore. That's the open Pacific. And if you look closely, and you ate, who tried a few oysters here? Yeah, so they were grown right here. See those little gridded patterns? That's our oyster farm. And I pulled them from ocean water yesterday at about 1 o'clock before I drove up here. So that's pretty fresh run from Tomales Bay. Yeah. So I just want you to have a visual sense of what we're talking about. And I also want to infomercial in the book. There is the price of admission is worth it just for the chapter called The Garden, because that chapter talks about people's involvement in procuring food from the intertidal zone primarily. There's another chapter about fisheries. And I like to acknowledge with this space, whether I'm walking people through it physically on the land or in the air, that, Hog Island's been there 40 years. Tomales Bay Oyster Company's been there 100 years. There's a famous text called Between Pacific Tides. And there's a guy, Doc, from Steinbeck's books that wrote that book. And there's a picture of him from 1935 standing back here, helping some oyster farmers deal with their oysters. So this is a famous intertidal biologist who was interested in the proposition of growing food in the ocean almost 100 years ago now. But we have a different optic here on Tomales Bay, and given some of the things that Tessa talked about, I think it's worth noting. We have shell mounds all around the bay. And in the national park, they've had the carbon-14 date some of those. We know that humans have been pulling oysters and clams and mussels out of the mud flats in Tomales Bay and walking them up to the ridge tops for at least 5,000 to 6,000 years, and probably a lot longer than that. And I think that's super important and fascinating to acknowledge that this relationship with, I don't think they were paying €5 an oyster back then. They were eating in this direct relationship with the coastal landscape, right? And the last piece about this picture that I think is important, this is taken at a moderately high tide, unlike the good lake out here. You guys don't go through tidal fluctuations. But at low tide, all this farm is exposed, right? It's got a skin of water over it that's shallow enough that we can see what's happening there. And in the Pacific Northwest, the tribal communities have a saying, when the tide is out, the table is set, right? And if you think about it, why wouldn't people have engaged with those food resources? Because all you had to do to eat good seafood, you didn't need Patagonia fly fishing gear or anything. You just needed to walk out on the low tide and pick it up, right? No fancy boats, nothing. And so it's not a surprise that we find those foodways going deep into the past. So of course, we're in the business of growing oysters, and that's how it's in our name. I should be wearing a Hog Island shirt. Infomercialing my favorite science podcast. But I wanted to put this picture up because if Tomales Bay is the place, and we farm oysters in Humboldt Bay as well, oyster farms exist up and down the West Coast and East Coast and in temperate areas around the world. But we have a restaurant, so we engage in the seafood trade as well. And I've chosen these pictures kind of for a specific reason, because as we think about the impact of our food choices on the planet, and particularly on the ocean, it turns out that the small things are probably the smartest things for us to be eating, right? And sometimes we can actually eat the problems we've created. So here we have the purple urchin, which, if you know much about the kelp forest losses on the Mendocino coast in particular, these guys are native but out of balance, right? So we're working with the Nature Conservancy to as a demonstration farm for fattening them up and making uni, right? And small fishes, it turns out, forage fishes, you know, super nutritious. Those abalone are red abalone, and if the white abalone is hard to work with in aquaculture, the red abalone, for whatever reason, is very easy to work with. And it's had its struggles in the wild coastal environments of California. But there are farms that are producing them by the hundreds of thousands. And so if you want to eat abalone today in California, you're going to have to eat it from a farm, because you can't take it from the wild anymore. And those are from those are from a really interesting project on the Sonoma coast. The Kashaya Band of the Pomo was recently returned some of their traditional coastal lands, and they're working closely with some scientists at formerly at Davis, now working for the tribe, to figure out if they can have an abalone farm on that property. And we buy a lot of abalone from a farm in Santa Barbara. We think it'd be super cool to be able to source our abalone for our restaurants from this tribal aquaculture project. And then that's Ogo. You guys are into seaweed, or had a Hawaiian poke bowl and had that little stringy garnish. That's part of a project that I have going on where we're removing seaweeds off our oyster gear. We've considered it a nuisance and a fouling organism for a long time. And one of our owners said, you know, we can eat this, right? And so we actually have a cool project with one of Tessa's former postdocs, Christy Croker, at UC Santa Cruz, looking at the kind of the ecology and potential economic opportunities associated with seaweeds on gear. So I start with this mosaic because ultimately we're growing food in the ocean. And it turns out that there's a lot of promise there. And yet, in order to grow food in the ocean, the enterprise, as opposed to chasing wild resources, which is a different approach to finding food in the ocean, if you're going to grow food in the ocean, you kind of have to pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the ocean, because these animals are all examples. We don't farm these. I just think they're important. Unfed aquaculture, right? We put the oysters out in Tamales Bay and we've embedded them back into a natural ecosystem, and we can't feed them. I keep looking, you know, I've been 10 years now trying to find the temperature knob on Tamales Bay, but there's no knobs, right? In unfed aquaculture. So it turns out that we have to pay a lot of attention to the science of what's happening around those things. So the place, the foods, the people, right? These are the OGs, John Finger and Terry Sawyer, and they still run the company. They've been hanging out around Tamales Bay for 40 years. I think back in the day, there might have been more surfboards, maybe more hair, although I really can't have much to say about that, right? And John's the CEO, and Terry's kind of this head science guy. He's been my mentor and has worked a lot with Tessa. A project with him is in the book. And the reason I like to show them is that Hog Island is a company that was founded. These guys are all marine biologists. There was a third guy for the first 20 years too. And they did not bring MBAs to the business. They came because they really believed in their hearts that there was a pathway to making a living while surfing. Oh no, I think it was maybe more complicated than that. No, making a living, righteously producing food in the ocean. John, I know, often cites the who's our famous Jacques Cousteau, right? His statement years ago that at some point we were going to have to start figuring out how to farm the oceans, produce food in the oceans. And I'd say that undercurrent is still there today, 40 years later. So what's the deal with oysters? It's just a couple of quick things, and then we're going to queue you guys up for questions. But unlike a lot of the animal proteins that we eat, when we put oysters in the ocean to farm them, or when they're there in the wild, they're doing some pretty cool stuff in the ecosystem. Filtering water is one of the ones that we recognize the most. And each one of those little dudes there that we were enjoying can filter somewhere between 30 and 50 gallons of water a day. Well, if we add up all the oysters that are being farmed in Tomales Bay, along with the wild native oysters that still live there, we're probably sneaking up on 60 to 80 million animals doing that kind of filtration work every day. And so in a way, the oysters that we grow are ensuring the water quality that we'll depend on to grow them again in the future, right? There's a virtuous feedback loop there. And in the meantime, that clean water is also improving light penetration for foundation species like eelgrass, seagrasses, which are harboring fishes and crabs and other important things. And so this is a Nature Conservancy graphic. They make graphics. It's the beauty of a well-funded nonprofit. So an acre of oysters, either on a farm or in a reef, 36 Olympic swimming pools. The other thing they're doing is provisioning habitat, right? We don't think of our food like, hey, how much habitat did your chickens provision? You know, that's not really how we think about chickens. But when we put those oysters back out, and again, whether they're on a reef or they're on a farm, they're providing structure. They're essentially forming artificial reefs. And again, this is a TNC project, one of my colleagues who is their lead aquaculture scientist. And they did a big meta-analysis of all the papers that people had done of what was happening around oyster farms worldwide, and found that in all cases for this unfed aquaculture, the kinds you see here, there was a greater both abundance and diversity of organisms around those farms than there were in their controls off the farm. So how amazing is it that this is a kind of food producing system that actually may be a net positive for the ecosystems where they're being produced? As a guy from Oklahoma, that had never occurred to me, that might be possible, right? So this is just kind of a picture that I love showing of one of our farm areas. Could have been where those oysters came from. These are our baskets. They're covered in a very generous macroalgae called ulba or sea lettuce. This is eelgrass, which is both a protected species and a very important foundation species. We are regulated in our relationship to this species. And yet what we find, and this has been documented by researchers in Washington, Oregon, and California, when you insert a bunch of filter feeders who are providing buffering of wave energy and maybe reducing the desiccation and filtering water, the eelgrass moves into the farm. And so it's quite interesting. And of course, in nature, there was and still is a synergy. I wouldn't say symbiosis, but a synergy between oyster reefs and eelgrass. They're doing things that benefit the others. And this is what our farm looks like. It's pretty low tech. So I want to finish with just a couple of slides. That's the old guy, me there. I have a science farm. So this is what I love about Hog Island. I am, as Tessa or somebody said, I'm a recovering academic. I've been off the wagon for 14 years, but I had an academic career before. I'm an ecologist. And I got really interested in food systems. And I was fortunate enough to be able to engage with food systems and their intersection with natural landscape scale ecosystems in other parts of the world. And when I moved out here, I was just fascinated with this proposition. So because John and Terry are marine biologists and not business guys, although they've been good enough business guys, they let me set up a science farm in the middle of the farm. where I can host research and do a bunch of different things. So I have this really cool science farm, and we have some Bodega Marine Labs projects going on there. We've got some other projects going on. And that's super cool because, like I said, if we're going to grow food in the ocean, we really need to understand what's happening in the ocean. And to Tessa's point about observation, some of these people that have been farming oysters for decades, they see these changes that are happening. And they don't necessarily have the language to explain what they're seeing, but they're key data collectors. And now we're able to take some of those observations and put some science to them and actually create information that can be used to inform how we manage the farm. You can ask questions about that if you want. This is an interesting picture that's really, it's abstract in a way, right? But it's actually at the intersection of Tessa's field and the work that I do, because these are baby oysters. And these are what they look like under a microscope at 1, 2, and 4 days after fertilization. So Pacific oysters, which is what we had there, broadcast spawners. The eggs go out, the sperm goes out, fertilization happens. And if you could catch them in the ocean, you could look at them. And anybody want to guess what these are from day 1, 2, and 4? What's that? Well, they're the full siblings of these animals, except they are in a ocean acidification simulation, right? So this is 8.0 pH water, and this is 7.5. This is what we're worried about 50 to 100 years from now being the baseline for the ocean. And you can see in those first few days, this is from a paper from some guys up at Oregon State, that these animals are not thriving. They're not able to build their shells in the way that they're supposed to be. And of course, ultimately, many of them won't survive. What happened in industry now about 18 years ago, the main hatchery where all the West Coast oyster farms were getting their baby oysters to plant out on their farms, it's called the Whiskey Creek Hatchery. They had a huge mortality event. All their baby oysters in their system died for reasons they couldn't explain. There was no, pathogens that could explain it. And over the next really several years, people started supporting the unpacking of that box. And it turns out that their intake, where they're pulling ocean water in to run their hatchery, had been exposed to some upwelled water from really deep. I think that's, and that deep water had a lower pH, and the molecules that these guys are building their shells out of, the calcium carbonate molecules, are less saturated the lower the pH. So they're trying to build themselves as fast as they can, and there's fewer molecules, fewer building blocks for them to gather in lower pH water. And so it took some time and a lot of science to figure out that what caused that mortality event in Oregon was kind of a harbinger of the future if ocean conditions continue to acidify. And really opened up a whole bunch of important dialogue about how to mitigate that, right? How to maybe prepare for that. And so we'll leave that, but I love that image because it's super interesting. So the last little piece I want to tell you about in terms of, I'm gonna make sure it's the last piece, yeah. So how do you deal with that stuff, right? We're trying to grow oysters for food. We have a business. We have 300 employees that are like family. We have to pay everybody. That's the idea. And so this is a picture of our hatchery. That's our algal lab where we're growing plankton to feed the baby oysters. But what really inspires me and where a lot of my science program is kind of looking right now is that it turns out, like many other marine animals, oysters are really, really ancient organisms, really ancient. Like fossils from the Cretaceous look like oysters, right? They haven't changed much in 100 million years. And what we're finding through collaborations with the academic community, whether it's around the question of surviving ocean acidification or surviving diseases that seem to be proliferating in a warmer ocean, is that these guys, even though they're primitive and simple, they don't have brains or eyeballs, their genomes are packed with information that probably have some clues to what might help them survive in a changing ocean. And so a lot of the focus right now in the oyster industry is on identifying those traits and seeing if we can select for them in our breeding programs. Can we select for a climate resilient oyster? That's the term that I use a lot when I'm talking to people, because, and what does that even mean? And if you select for, you know, one thing, if you know, we were talking about this, weakened them for some other thing, it's pretty complicated. But it does appear that the more we learn about unpacking the genomes of these animals, that there are genes that are unexpressed currently, but if you put them in a simulation and simulate a future climate or an intense disease event, many of them die, some of them don't die. And when you look at the ones that didn't die, often they start to exhibit a pattern of genetic similarity, those that survived. And then you can go select for those. You can say, well, I want the moms and dads that have those characteristics. And we're seeing some really early results on that with disease resistance. But I think climate resilience writ large is an important part of what we're doing. So that's just another little science area. And that's my slide to remind me to stop talking. And I think we want to invite you all to ask questions of either of us. And if they're hard questions, Tessa will answer them. And if they're easy ones, I'll answer. Yeah. That's it. And we'll keep that lovely backdrop.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Want us to repeat the question?
Yeah, gotcha. So the question is, do we repurpose oyster shells from our restaurants, from the farm? And it is an excellent question, and it is a tricky question because the use of oyster shells in restaurants is sort of spread out around the city. New York City has an exemplary oyster shell recycling program. It feeds into the Billion Oyster Project, which is a cool initiative there. In the Bay Area, we're still trying to figure it out. There are some efforts to collect them. We, of course, at the farm have Shell Mountain. I call it Shell Mountain, right? And that's where all the bits and pieces of shells end up that are produced, you know, on the farm. A lot of them, honestly, have gone into restoration efforts in the San Francisco Bay. When you cure those big shells, you can use them as recruitment targets for baby native oysters. And so there's a lot of shell material. That's what they're using them for at Billion Oyster Project. They're putting them back in the bay without the advent of brains or eyeballs. Oyster larvae, they live about 2 weeks in the open ocean, and then they settle and they grow a sticky foot for just a few days. And that foot is coated in chemosensors, like our tongues, and they're looking to stick themselves to calcium carbonate structures. So shells, right? Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yes. So the question is, what happened to the oyster company that closed? That little shimmering blue place, I'm so short, is Drake's Estero. And Drake's Bay Oyster Company's landlord was the National Park Service, the Department of Interior. Everybody that farms on Tamales works with the state of California. So it became contentious, and without drilling in a lot, the Park Service decided that an oyster farm inside a national park was not consistent. So when their lease was up, they didn't renew it. And, you know, I think that's clean and easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. We don't feel worried about that on the Tamala side because the charter of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is to care for fish and wildlife, both in the wild and in, you know, food producing systems. And so they will,
Are there any risks of water?
in general, you mean? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. So, yeah. Right. That's a good comparison. So for our friends out there, the questions about water quality and how changing water quality might threaten an oyster farm in Tamales Bay or really anywhere else. So one of the interesting things about food grade oysters is that in order to serve them to humans, the water around them has to essentially be drinking water quality in terms of the bacterial load. Obviously, the salt doesn't work, but we're all highly motivated to make sure that the water quality in our oyster producing bays and estuaries around the country, because there's a whole national it's called the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference, and those standards are set. Oysters will grow in dirtier water. San Francisco Bay grows a lot of native oysters. I hope you don't eat them, right? And so in Tamales Bay, you can see there's an agricultural landscape around us. We like to think we're famous, but I think there's this Cowgirl Creamery gig going on that, you know, there's a lot of famous cheese on the hills of West Marin. And of course, dairy farms have affluent. And we're very fortunate in Tamales Bay. It is a protected area by NOAA, National Marine Sanctuary. It has a national park. We have a lovely academic institution, UC Davis, who is continuously studying it. I'm sure you can't see it, but there's a Davis buoy right there floating around. It's right there, I know it. And that's sampling all kinds of water quality, chemistry issues. And we have a land trust, just like you guys do here around Tahoe. The Marin Agricultural Land Trust has worked closely with the dairy farms for a long time to make sure that they have the right check structures. But it's an ongoing concern because if in Humboldt Bay, the big issue right now is the wind energy development, right? We all want clean energy, but to build those towers, you need a huge facility, right? And to install that construction facility, you have to do a lot of dredging. Well, what's that going to? Humboldt Bay produces the most oysters of any bay in California. What happens if you dredge up legacy pollutants? You know, like you said, overnight, you could change the water quality in the bay. Obviously, there's a lot of precautionary work being done, but water quality is super important if you're going to eat the animals that you're throwing there and not cook them. Yeah. Oh, I thought it was the question. Yeah. Yeah, super good question. So, and an important one. We are not modifying them. We're selecting the moms and pops that have the traits that we want. So it's a subtle difference. We're studying their genetics in the way that Luther Burbank, you know, visually looked at like, hey, these apples are awesome, you know, or these berries are awesome. And so I'm going to choose these as my brood stock and not the ones that didn't taste awesome. So we're not splicing in genes or splicing out genes. We're not mixing species through genetic manipulation. we're using the optic of modern genetics and genomics to better understand what's being expressed in the animals that have the traits that we prefer versus the ones that we don't. So, but let me not greenwash that too much, right? And this is an issue on the East Coast. Every farm on the East Coast of the United States that grows oysters is growing the native Atlantic oyster, Coauthor virginica, same one that lives in the wild. But I work with Vim's and Rutgers and their hatcheries, and I guarantee you that the animals they're selling, they're the same species, but they've been super highly selected for disease resistance, to thrive in high salinity or low salinity. They are not quite the same as their wild brethren in cistern, right? Adjacent to them, and that's of concern to people interested in the preservation of genetic diversity in wild populations. So it's not an issue in the ecological context, but I would say it's not the same issue as, if we were splicing guppy genes into, oysters to make them move faster. Yeah,
Agreed.
It's a great question. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's a big think question.
Yeah,
and
no,
with the abalone project, it's super interesting.
So some of that work has happened in the abalone restoration world as well, because Gary described some of these experiments where we raise organisms under reduced pH. That's a consequence of, as the atmosphere gets more and more carbon dioxide in it, the actual chemistry of the ocean is changing, which is what Gary was alluding to. So in these experiments where we raise oysters, mussels, abalone under future conditions, so we sort of time machine them and we say, what will these animals do if they're in conditions that we predict to happen in 100 years? Some of those organisms die because the conditions are too stressful, but not all of them. And so what that tells you is there's a little scope for adaptation there. And people who are doing either aquaculture for food purposes or aquaculture for restoration purposes are very interested in, these ones that were exposed to a stressor and actually survived. Those might be the ones that we want to put out in the world as it changes. And so I think I wouldn't consider that a GMO abalone. I would consider it a selected abalone. So we've selected for conditions that we know are going to be in the future ocean.
Right.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I would say that's right at the, not a lot of that is happening yet, but it's a big part of the conversation about the choices we're going to have to make about restoring species in the future. Because we can't just keep putting the same species with the same genetic material into where they used to live. It's actually not going to work. And so we actually have to make some hard decisions about, are we going to move species to different locations, or are we going to select for species that might survive these conditions, or are we going to give up on these species? These are the conversations that are happening, I think, in the restoration and conservation world.
Yes.
So, so as a company, I don't know how far out they're thinking, but are they looking?
Well, yeah. So to repeat the question and generalize it, as a business who's been around 40 years, and John and Terry say they hope that it lasts another 40, maybe longer. What are we thinking about to be ready for the future? Are we looking to leases in more favorable areas, for example? It's an interesting question. I think the kind of work we're doing here is more how we would answer that question. We're trying to work with the research community to understand, what might thrive in the places that we are, but in the future. And I want to piggyback on that a little bit, just an earlier picture. So one of the things that we're doing as a company, and it's almost trivial at the moment, but it's becoming less trivial all the time. We're trying to diversify, right? One of the best hedges against uncertainty is to diversify. And instead of just growing one species of oyster, we're now looking at, I mean, we actually grow 5 species. We're very unusual, but we're looking at increasing the number of species that historically we would have said, you know, a lot of selection for most things was driven by the sort of crude selector of speed. How fast can I get something to market? How fast can I grow an oyster and get it to market so that I can grow the next one, right? Or whatever that is. Well, it turns out that when you select for fast growth, you're probably selecting against some really important stuff like immune system and resilience. You know, we're learning that. But we're looking at diversification as an important way to be more resilient. We're already seeing, and this is mind-blowing for a lot of people, with this species right here, the one you were eating, the Miyagi, the Japanese, or Press Austria gigas, our background mortality in Tamales Bay every day is almost 50% of what we bring in. So if the restaurants say we need 50,000 oysters for the weekend, the farm guys have got to bring in 100 because half of them are not going to have survived. And that has not changed a lot. They've been dealing with a high background mortality in Tamales Bay for a long time. As we learn as we've worked with the research community, we're finding that there are animals that survive better. And we're now on my science farm, we've now got mortalities down to 5%, right? Same farm, same areas, right? So science is helping us be prepared in ways that we think are important. But this species, which is native to the East Coast, is hardly ever seen on the West Coast. And it turns out that it's way less vulnerable to a lot of the diseases that this species is vulnerable to. And so we're working with Rutgers and VIMS right now and people at Davis to figure out if we could maybe start farming those again. Before the Japanese oyster was introduced to the West Coast, everybody was farming the New York oyster, and it grows a little slower. But maybe slow is okay if your mortality rates drop from 50% to 5 or 10.
But what is the was there a native California oyster?
There definitely was.
Part of the reason that non-native
Outcompeted it. Yeah. So no, we tapped them out before we introduced the Japanese oyster. But all those shell mounds, like anybody been to IKEA in Emeryville? You know, at Berkeley, right? That IKEA is built on the site of a giant shell mound. That's why the road's called Shell Mound. You know, 10, 20 meters high and several city blocks. It was raised in the 30s, all made of shells, mussels, clams, and native Olympia oyster shells, right? Today, they're a shadow of their former selves. We actually farm them. I'm working with the Nature Conservancy on a kind of a eat them to save them model. I have about 500,000 of them in Tamales Bay in culture. And then we're you know, it's an interesting project. So here's the business side of it. See the size of that one compared to this one? That's about how big an Olympia oyster gets at 5 years. And that's a 1-year Pacific. So there's no business model for an animal that gets a third of the size in 4 to 5 years. Yeah.
What's the cause of?
Historically, the gold rush was a whammy, right? We harvested all the big animals, and then there's not enough moms and pops producing larvae, and then the siltation that buried their habitats, the kind of the 1-2 punch.
What's the cause of current?
Oh, with our farmed oysters, we'd like to know that better. But disease we think is a big stressor. There's a disease that came over from the native habitat that they're highly vulnerable to. There's bacterial diseases, oyster diseases, not people diseases. Yeah. Similar. Those are different pathogens, but the same idea. When you breed for growth solely over decades, we've now learned that often those fast-growing animals have compromised immune systems and they don't thrive. If anything goes south, the temperature gets a little too warm or a disease vector kind of picks up, a lot of those animals just tap out. So I would say, disease, but disease driven probably with underlying climate, elements. Yeah, I see the person.
I'll-
We have time for one last.
Jerry sits down. For the sake of the video recording, we've been asked to share what our sort of connection or resonant point is with the ocean. That's actually, it's very hard for me because there are a lot of them. But I grew up on the shores of Puget Sound, the Salish Sea. And I think that as a very young child, I actually felt more comfortable and confident on the beach and in Puget Sound, which kind of is amazing looking back because it's cold. But I spent a lot of my childhood in the Sound. I think I was encouraged to just be an independent observer and a patient observer of nature. And I think it shaped every decision I made after that about where I would spend my time. So I will just briefly say that I moved from growing up in the south of Seattle. I moved to Florida for my undergraduate degree, and I spent 4 years in the Gulf of Mexico, and you could not get me out of that water. At which point I said, I need to go to graduate school because I need to stay in the water. And so I went to graduate school at UC Santa Barbara and then moved up to Bodega Marine Lab after that. So I think my connection to the ocean came at a very early stage. And I guess I should stop talking, but I will say it also was around foodways. And so we dug for clams and we appreciated and loved salmon in a way that's sort of hard to describe to people who have not grown up in the Pacific Northwest. But I think I have both like a physical and emotional connection to the ocean, but also like a stomach connection to the ocean. Gary?
I grew up in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I didn't have an ocean connection until about 13 years ago. It was terrifying to me. I went to grad school in Boulder, and I kept moving west, and I bumped into this thing called the edge of the continent. But I will say for me, my space, I fish from the kayak. When I found out there weren't whitewater rivers here when I moved from Colorado, I was like, well, I'll get a kayak that goes on the ocean. But the corollary to that is that it is the most humbling place that I spend time. Even when I'm just a half mile or a mile offshore in a tiny boat, I'm like totally, you see your place, right? You see your place. And I think I value that a lot.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Tessa and Gary. Tessa will be selling some of her books at the back of the room. You are welcome to purchase them from her. And thank you, Gary, for plucking and shucking. They have noticed that there are still some oysters left. And so if everybody would like to help themselves to a few more, you are welcome to No oyster left behind.
Since you invoked Princess Bride and you said, there will be no surprise.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, or me, yeah. Hey, bro.